In other words, they've been educated by our society to react in this kind of way, to imagine that if people question, for example, the fact that there's only that there are many, many genders, and basically assert the fact that there are in fact only two biological sexes, they will know straight away that the first word they will throw at you is that you're homophobic. And where did they get this idea that people like you and me are homophobic just because we're old-fashioned enough to believe that there's only two biological sexes?
No, I actually... You are Professor Emeritus in Sociology at the University of Kent and the author of countless books. I counted 18. Am I right about that, or are there more that I've forgotten?
Yeah, there's what, 26. Yeah.
Wow, that is amazing. At the moment, you are director of MCC Brussels, and I want to come to all of that, but I was interested in starting at the beginning, or asking the burning question that you probably get all the time, which is, you started out very left-wing, and many people say you've traveled to the dark side. You are now very right-wing. Is that a correct characterization of your political trajectory?
Well, the way that I look at it is that I've always been driven by very similar impulses. Even as a child, growing up in Hungary and seeing my family take part in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, I always had a very strong sense of injustice and justice. And I always felt the need to kind of take a stand and fight for what I believed was right. And essentially, that kind of impulse has always been a very powerful one. To this day, I react quite passionately, quite strongly to things that I think are utterly wrong. And the way that I look at it is that I felt when I was becoming a university student, I was a student radical. Me and my friends managed to close down McGill University for about a month, and we did really well in terms of making an impact. At the time, being a student radical in the 1960s was in the air. You felt this sense of freedom that anything was possible. And I'm one of the few people of that era who doesn't have any regrets. Obviously, you did a lot of silly, foolish things at the time, and you saw things sometimes in a fairly limited, distorted way. But that's an experience that has made me what I am, as did all my experiences. And the way that I look at it is that there were certain dynamic elements within me that are constant. And the way I see it is that the political language that we use today, where we categorize left and right, is really confusing and fails to understand that what these concepts meant classically is very different to what left and right means. So, for example, classically, being on the left was about being future-oriented, believing in experimentation, committed to science, committed to freedom and humanism, whereas being left today is very much about being obsessed with identity politics. It's really about a kind of very stagnant theory of sustainability where the economy kind of stays still. And the left very rarely has got any relationship to the people, which is something that I always hope to forge, and I did forge at times, because you as an activist want to speak for the people and be part of the people, and that kind of ideal is still with me today. I don't see myself as either left or right. I've got a very clear idea of what I am, and that's got to do with different dimensions of my experience. So when it comes to family life, when it comes to tradition, when it comes to history, I feel very strongly that these things need to be conserved. So I suppose I would be very conservative when it comes to education in particular, the bringing up of children. When it comes to people's lives, individual lives, the choices they make, the way they express themselves, I take a very classically liberal position. I believe in their right to make choices as long as they're prepared to live with the consequences of those kinds of choices. And when it comes to social and economic matters that affect people's everyday lives, I suppose I take what is almost like a classically socialist point of view, where I really believe that we have the duty to provide people with the best healthcare, the best education. We have to ensure that opportunities for everybody are made available. So I'm all of these three different things, and other people have to decide what that is. Maybe they can find a better name than I can. But I think at a moment when we're living in such confused political world, it's far better to follow your instincts, and who cares where you end up? And if people want to call me right wing or far right or whatever, they're just showing their political immaturity, that they don't understand the context within which we live today.
It's funny that you said that in the past you had seen the left as being kind of pro-science. But, they would argue that they are, and that the right is not scientific. So I was reading a paper the other day that was talking about, it's actually really amazing to me, because any questioning of, gender ideology was lumped in with questioning evolution and all these other things. And the author called it troll science, that the right doesn't do science. They do pseudoscientific counter narratives that is it's similar to trolling people online, whereas the left is the domain of true science. So is it true that the left has left science behind? Because they claim to be on the side of science when it comes to things like COVID, when it comes to things like climate change, and gender and so on.
Well, the left uses the term not science, but the science. In other words, putting a definitive article before science, which gives science this very dogmatic quality that all the questions have been settled. There's no point in debating the climate issue because the science has spoken. It's almost like the Delphi oracle, the way they talk about the science. And I think it's that kind of very static sort of notion that actually sort of deprives science of its dynamic, transformative content that they have in mind. And they use science in a very ideological way as well, where they basically denounce people like myself who maintain that there's actually only two sexes, sort of biological sexes, males and females. They think that that's unscientific. They think that somehow I violated some fundamental principle. But that's just a posturing, an ideological posturing on their part, because their commitment to real science, which is open-ended and ready to yield to new experience, which requires debate and discussion, not just simply an ideological stance that everything has been settled, is really alien to it at the moment. And in many ways, science has got a real problem because it's become so politicized that you got to be very careful how you approach the subject, because at the end of the day, you want to make a distinction between your political ideology or political agenda and allow science the freedom to make its own way, and regardless of the political outlook of the scientists, to essentially, sort of discover the wonderful and important things that need to be discovered.
In fact, at the moment, there's so much certainty around the science that even when science appears to have moved on from the science, people in power, governments have adopted this new term, not misinformation, but malinformation. Are you familiar with that term?
I have come across it, yes, and I think it reflects a very important political trend, and that hasn't really been picked up, because what has happened is that as science becomes more and more politicized, then what happens is that a politicized version of science begins to be used as a substitute for political decision making, as a way of avoiding debate. Because if you can say that it's the science that has decided that this is the way it should be, rather than a politician argue that this is what should be done, then you cannot debate the science, whereas you can debate the politician. So politicizing the science basically means that you close down discussion. And this really happened during the COVID experience, when you had this double phenomenon where public health became politicized, and at the same time, politics became medicalized. So you had this phenomenon running alongside of each other, where the health issue was entirely treated from a political standpoint. At the same time, because of the obsessive character of public health, it became the dominant frame through which political debate, was taking place. And I think that kind of immature way of understanding both public health and science does lead to its ultimate corruption.
Do you think it's possible to have malinformation, information that's just, maybe it's not wrong, but it's dangerous? It's something that, we shouldn't leave to the masses.
Well, I think it is possible to have information that is dangerous, without a doubt. But the way you deal with dangerous information is by having the courage of your conviction and exposing it to be flawed. I mean, this has been a debate that's been going on ever since the 19th century, when the discussion emerged in England in particular, which the discussion was, what do you do when people lie? What do you do when people make things up and circulate that information through newspapers and other media? And a lot of people felt that this was a very good argument for closing down discussion, for censoring malinformation. Whereas some people like J.S. Mill would say, well, actually, the way you have to deal with this is by attacking it, debating it, exposing the lies to the public. And because that's the only effective way of ensuring that truth will eventually prevail.
See, I find these things to be very left-wing, having a strong belief in humanity and the human capacity to hear ideas, to reflect on them, and to judge how to act. But I find myself increasingly alone in that in that belief that this is actually, it comes from the Enlightenment, which was a very revolutionary moment in history, and that we don't, when we move forward, we don't just throw out the past and the ideas of the past and the incredible revolutionary potential of that belief in the human subject. So going back to some of your own political history, have you always had these kinds of ideas, or did you change, or did something happen at some point where this belief in the human subject, in the capacity for human beings to just kind of judge for themselves, as a core aspect of progressive politics, did that wither away at some point?
Well, obviously I changed, because any semi-intelligent individual who is as old as I am needs to change. If I hadn't changed, I would be a caricature of myself, which I hope I'm not. And obviously the world has changed quite a bit. But there were certain elements in my politics when I was left-wing, which the left didn't accept, which many left-wing people thought that I wasn't a genuine article. I wasn't really left-wing. So I'll give you 3 examples. The first example I remember, this was in 1969. I was at a party, and a lot of my radical friends were talking about their horrible mothers, their horrible fathers, and how much they hated their family. And I kind of innocently said that actually I love my parents. They may not be perfect all the time, but I really love them, and have a very close emotional affinity with my family. And people looked at me as if I was some kind of a pariah, because people in their eyes who said they loved their family couldn't be a genuine left-wing activist radical. So I had that as very important element. The second thing that I had that was very, very strong, and this comes from my Hungarian origins and living under Stalinism and being part of the revolution, is I've always been fairly suspicious of the state. I've always been very suspicious of being told, and relying on the state to make my way in the world, because I felt that when the state intervenes too much in people's lives, it always has some kind of a disorienting or perverse consequences. So unlike all the left who looked to the state to solve the problems of society, because that was like basically the paradigm that they all kind of adopted, I and some of my close friends, we never had these illusions in the state. And thirdly, and this was something that probably more than anything else marked me out in the 1970s as not a genuine left-wing person had to do with free speech. And that what happened in the 1970s, I wrote a pamphlet called Under the National Flag. And what the pamphlet was about was criticizing the attempt of the British left to no platform National Front members, this right-wing organization, who they basically called fascists and Nazis. And I argued, I think I and my friends were the only people that argued for the right of the National Front to have their voice heard. Because I tried to explain that if you begin to close down discussion and what we call cancel a particular group because they're fascist, then tomorrow other organizations will get the same kind of treatment. But not only that, the point is that if you think that what they're saying is so wrong, let the people hear it and have the courage of your conviction to be able to argue against it. And this caused an outrage. And many people, that's the first time ever I was called a kind of a fascist sympathizer because I argued against it. So there were certain elements in my ideals that are very much what I am today. But obviously I've changed and I developed new ideas. I realized that I was wrong about certain things, as any human being can be. And hopefully learning from my mistakes has given me greater capacity to understand the world today. And in particular, the journey has been wonderful because I can see much clearer both where people who call themselves left-wing and people who call themselves right-wing actually come from and what motivates them and what the issues are that preoccupies them.
So on one of these topics that you mentioned, on the idea of the family, I don't know if it's maybe like coming from, I come from an Indigenous background mixed with Irish, so I have a humongous family. I've got over 30 first cousins, 40 aunts and uncles, a humongous family. And for me, family was always a source of, although we had all sorts of problems, we're Indigenous, right? Got all kinds of problems. I found family always to be a source of trust and joy and so on, even when bad things happened. But this seems to be something that is quite problematized now. And I wonder, and going back to kind of left versus right, it seems like the family has become just straightforwardly a right-wing issue, which is quite curious to me that it should be bipartisan in this way, because okay, maybe the left might have some ideas about the family that are a bit different, right? They might emphasize different things, but to think of the families in which the vast majority of humanity lives could be just a right-wing issue is shocking to me. And I wondered if you could sort of shed some light on how that happened, and if it's a bad thing that we don't really have any deep debate about families that crosses a political divide.
Well, I think the reason why the family has got such negative connotations today, particularly by people who promote identity politics, is due to the fact that somewhere along the line, the ideology developed in the late 60s, which basically said that the personal is political. And when they began to argue that the personal is political, then that gave them the warrant to look into people's private lives. And as they looked into people's private lives, which was principally the family, they invented this idea called the dark side of the family. And according to this kind of idea of the dark side of the family, they basically made this so-called discovery, which suggested that people in a family relationship are brutal and toxic towards one another, particularly men towards women, but also parents towards children. And therefore, rather than the family being seen as a site of loving care and nurturing, it became seen as a kind of a brutal battleground on which violence was endemic. And initially, this was a minority point of view, but gradually from the 1970s onwards, it gained so much traction that I remember writing an article on the family in the turn of the century and looking at all the books that have been written on it, but mainly by social scientists, and struggling to find a single book, not even one book, that had something positive to say about the family, that basically said, the family is good. Thank God we got a family. It looks after people. Instead of saying that, what they were saying was the very opposite, that the family is problematic, that women need to have their own space separate from the family, that children were at risk. And just today, there was a discussion in Brussels, where I work, in the European Union, where they made this big new initiative, where basically what they really are arguing is that the aim of the European Union is to ensure that a significant section of young children between the age of 0 and 3 years are put into childcare nurseries, and that they hope that in about 5 years' time, the percentage of kids that are going to be put in nurseries is going to increase. So you might think, well, that's good. Childcare is not a problem. But what they're really saying is that the European Union trusts the experts that work in nurseries more than mothers and fathers to do the right thing by their kids.
Yeah, and of course, full disclosure, I'm a visiting visiting fellow at MCC Brussels, and I've been doing research on this. And this is one of the reports that we have coming out. This is precisely the shift that's happened, where childcare used to be understood as something that was of benefit to parents. And it's interesting when you look at the literature that comes out of the EU, they say things like, well, fathers need to take up more of the childcare, and states need to provide childcare to free the woman up to work. But that's the main purpose. It's to work. And then even that over time has gone away. And now the main purpose of childcare is to intervene in the child's life at an early time, to sort of correct the mistakes and stop these kind of shifty ideas from being passed from one generation to the next. I wonder, where's that interest coming from? Why is there so little trust in everyday people to do something like raise children, which people have been doing since there have been humans, and even before that, since we've been swinging from the trees?
I think that the way to understand it is that there are two dominant political elements that dominate the outlook of our political establishments, our cultural elites. One of them is the politics of identity, and there you have the personal and political, which we already discussed. But the other side is more of a technocratic imperative towards social engineering. And from the point of view of technocratic expertise, they basically believe that child rearing is a skill. They often talk about parenting skills as if it's like learning to become a mechanic, the skills of being a plumber or an electrician. So from their point of view, parenting is a skill. And the way they see it is that parents are at best, hapless amateurs, but at worst, they're complicit in messing up their children. And that ideal has been very strong within the American progressivist tradition, going back to the turn of the 20th century. It's been very, very strong within the technocratic social engineering tradition of social democracy within Europe. It's very powerful in the European Union because it's the dominant outlook of the bureaucrats who are there. And I think it's this kind of conviction that parents cannot be trusted, and that parents are a kind of an inconvenience at best that you got to put up with. But the faster you get away the kids from their grasp, and the more you inform them and socialize them, so that they begin to have ideals that are quite separate to that of their parents, those sentiments are extremely powerful in school pedagogy and also in the industry that looks after nurseries and various other child rearing enterprises.
So on that, maybe it's jumping ahead a little bit, but tell me a bit about your work with MCC. So what got you interested in Brussels? You went from Kent in the UK to Brussels. So what's the story?
Well, the story is this. I mean, I was very happy, sitting in my office writing, because I love writing. It's one of my big loves in life, and it's something that I just really enjoy doing. And I would probably even do it for free if I had to, because I get a lot of pleasure out of that. But then as I was doing this, as I was writing, I became increasingly aware that the world was changing quite rapidly. And it wasn't changing for the good. It was getting worse and worse from a cultural, civilizational point of view. And I know that very often I'm sitting around the breakfast table, talking with my wife, listening to the news, and we kind of looked at each other and we said, either we're idiots or what they're saying is idiotic. It had to be one or the other. And then I kind of realized that the kind of culture war that was being waged everywhere in the world, but it's very, very strong in Europe now. It used to be principally an American and an Anglo-American kind of accomplishment. I felt that it was really quite important that I took a stand and I did something in order to find a narrative that can effectively deal with this. And it just so happened that MCC Brussels, which is a Hungarian-linked organization, was looking for somebody to run their think tank. And it just so happened that basically said, "Do you want to do the job?" And I said, "I would love to come to Brussels to stir things up a little bit and to project a different narrative where we essentially fight for the civilizational values that were essential for the development of Western culture, but not just for Western culture, but for the whole of humanity." So what we're doing is with a really lovely team, we're kind of developing a narrative that calls into question things like the impulse of the European Union to basically promote transgender ideology, the attempt by the European Union to promote LGBTQ values to the point at which that, as they put it, they want to queer the world, to go to Brussels and to challenge the narrative that calls into question the legitimacy of the nation, of national borders, that calls into question the legitimacy of all those historical traditions that have been quite important, and in particular, who wants to make us feel ashamed about our past, rather than understanding that the organic connection between where we come from and where we are today is essential if we're going to know where we're going to go in the future. And one of my big battles at the moment is to defend the history of Europe, the historical achievements of Europe. Obviously, not uncritically, because obviously there are negative aspects to it, but by and large, the positive legacies of Greece, Rome, Christianity, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, these are all important component parts of our foundation as a civilized world. And I think one of the things that we're doing is to basically stand up for that and promote an alternative narrative to the one that the EU is projecting. It's very exciting.
So why is that important? Why is it important? Because I know people will say, "Oh, Western civilization, culture war, all these things are dog whistles, for nefarious kinds of maybe white supremacy or something like that." Why does it matter? Can we not move forward and hear other voices and give other people time? Haven't we heard enough from the West?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to move forward. I'm a big believer in being bold, taking decisive step forwards, being open to new experience and yielding to that experience. We've got a lot to learn yet. We haven't had the final word on most of the issues of our time. But the point is that whatever we do that's going to be creative, that's going to be exciting, and that's going to matter to the lives of people will only be achieved if it's based on a certain foundation. And the foundation that is really quite important are inextricably linked to the kind of values and the kind of traditions that grew up. So, for example, what are we going to do, without Greek philosophy? Because whenever you think of individual Greek philosophers, Plato or Aristotle, and the other individuals, it doesn't really matter. The point is that the Greeks have taught us how to reflect, how to think, how to abstract. They taught us to understand the distinction between our humanity, our human qualities, and those of other species. So they basically provided us with a certain intellectual outlook that has been evolving and developing, and sometimes in a way that's modified all of the time. And we learned a lot of things from the Romans, from the Renaissance, from all these things we learned quite a lot from. And without these intellectual and moral resources and the values that emerged, we're left with what I call a year zero history. We're left with essentially very, very little. And you'll find that it's interesting because those people that reject that tradition are then confronted with the challenge. What are their values? What are they going to tell their children about what is right and what is wrong? What kind of direction are they going to give to the younger generations? And when you look at the values that they put forward, they're basically are values that they've invented from thin air. They're what I would call administrative values that were administratively created. So in the European Union, the big value which they ripped off from America is diversity. But when you think about it, diversity is not a real value. All that it basically says is that the more the merrier. Right now, okay, you might think that it's good to have diverse people, diverse experiences, but that's not a value in and of itself, any more than arguing that you need homogeneity, where you don't have diversity but just one. That's not a value either. Inclusion to raises the question: inclusion to what, right? And the minute you ask that question, inclusion to what, that's another way of raising the question: well, what is it that we want to be part of? And they can never answer the question, what is it want to be part of? Because they have no sense of a common vision of the world, something that builds real solidarity. And that's why you will find that the values that they put forward are just made up all the time and lead to very often to very negative sort of consequences. So, yeah, I think this is crucially important because I want to be in a position where I tell my grandson or when I tell my young students, these are the values that made us what we are, and these are values that you need to nourish and develop further, as every generation must. But you cannot imagine for 1 second that you can just start from scratch and reinvent all the good things or reinvent, sort of something that isn't so good. Because that's not going to work.
Yeah, we don't make history just from nothing. You make history based on the circumstances that are transmitted from the past. That's what you have to work with. And it seems to me that if you have this kind of idea of the future as a project that humanity is kind of building together, then you're going to meet people where they are, right? Like, it doesn't mean you're going to agree with everybody, but you don't see people as fundamentally the problem, right? It's about convincing people and trying to build something and trying to build something that we can agree on and get excited about and want to be included in, in some sort of future-oriented project. But if you see people as the problem, values as the problem, and the impediment, then that's where your analysis is focused. That's where your activism is focused. It will be on changing people, because they're the thing that's stopping us from moving forward. The future is just, I don't know, something that can be created from thin air. And if we could just fix people, then we would just get there. I don't know. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're really saying is that if you have this orientation that things that there aren't these values that can motivate people, if you have this orientation that we're just inventing things from anew, then what you also very often conclude is that the people don't get it. And they very often use this very paternalistic ideal that, oh, they just don't get it. And that's both anti-democratic in a sense, because the logic of that is that if they don't get it, it's pointless having elections, it's pointless having public life, and pointless having electoral politics. But if they don't get it, then also what that does, and this is why in America this concept has really flourished, is this idea that there are people that do get it, and then there are people that don't. So the people that do get it are in America called the ones that are on the right side of history. They are aware that they are what I call awareness raisers. They raise the awareness of the unaware, and they have this kind of contemptuous phrase that they use. It's probably the one woke phrase that I hate more than anything, and that's when they tell people like me sort of go educate yourself. Why don't you educate yourself? And when somebody says, why don't you educate yourself? They don't say, Frank, go to a library and read books, sort of, and have a better grasp of the subtleties of the world. They basically say, when they say, go educate yourself, that you have to think the way we do. And until you have the same ideas as we have, until you follow us in terms of our outlook on the world, you're going to become unaware. Sort of, you're not going to understand who your really interests are, and that kind of division that's been created is really at the heart of politics in the modern world, certainly in the West, and that's really at the heart also, obviously, of the culture wars and the conflicts that surround it between these two kinds of people.
Do you think it's also, I have this pet theory that a lot of public discourse is being driven by teenagers with anime avatars because they're so rabid online, and you don't know who you're talking to. You assume, you engage in good faith, and then this person begins to attack you. And, with me, I've had people sort of at my employer and this sort of thing trying to get me in trouble, and it can be quite scary. But I realize, and when I'm tempted to kind of be snarky back, I think this is probably like an 18-year-old kid, And I wonder if it's just this, is it like youthfulness that we are taking seriously? Because I had a lot of these ideas that I see coming at me, I recognize myself in them. When I was 19, 20 years old or something like that, and I was an undergraduate in university, I took like, I don't know, 3 anthropology classes, and all of a sudden I was an expert. And I would have said, educate yourself, go educate yourself. And what I meant was take anthropology 101, be educated like I am. And I just wonder, is it this, we're taking too seriously a very kind of youthful ignorance or belligerence or even idealism? Or is it something more nefarious or deeper?
I think it's deeper. I think obviously all of us when we're young, can be a pain. So all of us can think very highly of ourselves and be very opinionated about the world. All of us can look down upon our elders, our parents, think that, oh my God, they don't understand this, they don't know how to fix this. I understand, mobile technology better than they do. So you can have all these views, and that's normal, and probably it's even healthy when you have that kind of when young people kick up against the older generation. That's part and parcel of the way in which they historically have developed their identity. But it seems to me that although the phenomena you describe exists, these 18-year-olds who are giving you a hard time and have, fairly vicious ways of communicating their hatred and their dislike towards you, and it's a very casual hatred as well. It comes very easily for them to hate. They get these sentiments, these emotional reactions from people that are older than them. In other words, they've been educated by our society to react in this kind of way, to imagine that if people question, for example, the fact that there's only that there are many, many genders, and basically assert the fact that there are in fact only 2 biological sexes, they will know straight away that the first word they will throw at you is that you're homophobic. And where did they get this idea that people like you and me are homophobic just because we're old-fashioned enough to believe that there's only 2 biological sexes? They get that idea from people that are educated them, some of their teachers. They get their ideas from older people in the media, the so-called influencers. They get that idea from the cultural elites. They get that idea when they watch Netflix and they watch all those movies and TV programs that promote this kind of idea. So I think that the problem is much deeper than that, because they've been socialized by irresponsible adults who have incited them and indoctrinated them to think in this way. And that's why, for me, they're the problem rather than the 18-year-old kids.
I actually